Right, so today we are testing the Intel Arc A750 in Cyberpunk 2077. Now let's just go over the system specs quickly. I'll put it on the screen right now. Today we're pairing this GPU with a 12400F CPU from Intel. That again is paired with 16 gigabytes of DDR4 3600 MHz CL18 memory. I'm running on Windows 10 Pro and game mode, and rebar is enabled, and I just got run over by a stupid car. Alright, so let's just go over the settings quickly and let's just get rid of this. So I'll be testing at 1080p, 1440p and 4K. So if we have a look at the preset here, it's set to custom at the moment, but this is actually on the medium preset. I just disable XeSS because it gets enabled by default, and then I just disable motion blur and all these other post-processing effects as well. Right, so as you can see, we're at 1080p, and here we go. Alright, so we are just outside of V's apartment, apartment building 10 or mega building 10. It's been a while since I played this game. Actually looking forward to the expansion that's supposed to be coming out sometime soon, but until then we are stuck with the base game. Anyway, as you can see, we're getting around 80 frames per second, right? So this is at 1080p medium. I just need to state that texture detail is set to high. You can only adjust the texture detail in the main menu, not in the game menu. So I just set that to high, and that just means we're using a little bit more VRAM, but seeing that this is an 8GB GPU, 1080p for this GPU should not be a problem. Alright, let's just drive around a little bit, because driving around is actually a little bit more demanding. I actually installed the latest beta drivers for Intel Arc. It's not the recommended drivers, but the beta drivers seem to have added support for Diablo 4 and Street Fighter 6, and it actually solved some issues with regards to my Elgato capture card black screening every now and again. I don't think it's happened since I did that, so hopefully that doesn't happen again. Right, but you can see we're getting a pretty decent experience. I'd call anything above 60 frames per second in Cyberpunk decent. Obviously it's a first-person shooter game, so my aim personally is 60 frames per second. I do think that 60 frames per second on PC should be what you are aiming for. If you want a 30 frames per second experience, then you can play Starfield on the consoles. Alright, let's just see what the game actually does once there's a little bit of combat. And you can see that our frame rate does stay above 60, it stays above 70 actually. Now once again, this is a 1080p native, no XeSS just yet. So for those of you who aren't, oops, another car. These cars are quite dangerous in this game. So for those of you who aren't aware, XeSS is also an AI upscaling method. We'll talk right now. And we had to refresh our benchmark numbers because I was dumb enough to die. Anyway, so XeSS is pretty similar to NVIDIA's DLSS in the sense that it uses AI for upscaling, whereas FSR relies purely on software. And it actually does have an ultra quality mode as well, which has a slightly higher internal resolution than DLSS and FSR quality. So that helps, especially if you're playing at 1080p and you just want a slightly higher frame rate, but not that big a downgrade in the visuals. Alright, so we had an average of 83 frames per second. Yeah, 1% lows are sitting at 57, and our 0.1% lows are sitting at 50. And wow, these cars are really, really dangerous. I maybe should just get out of the road. So, when does it end? Alright, I'm trying. Alright, I'm out of the road. So you can see that our 1% lows and 0.1% lows are actually pretty respectable when compared to the average. I mean, it's not perfect, but I think it's pretty good for an Intel GPU. Alright, let's see what happens on the high preset. Once again, I'm just going to enable the high preset, then I'm going to disable XeSS, and then disable all these post-processing effects as well. Alright, so let's just reset our numbers here. And we didn't drop that much, right? So we are still in the 70s to 80s average frame rate there, although I did see a drop below 70 frames per second there, so it's not entirely identical, but it gets pretty close, right? Now, one thing that I did notice is that there are some artifacting in road surfaces, Let me see if I can find an example here for you. For instance, this white line where it crosses the yellow line, there's a little bit of shimmering if you look at it at a certain angle. And I'm not sure if it's actually game related. I'll have to test it with another GPU. Now, this is not upscaling related either, but just look at the distance there. I'm not going to move my mouse just past the truck, more or less in the middle of the screen, just a little bit towards the top. You'll see that those vending machine textures do not load. Now, I did see this this is a bit of an issue with Cyberpunk, especially if you have a look at that logo over there, the Kabayan Foods. The moment you get a little bit closer, the texture detail just increases quite a lot, and it doesn't happen with all designs. It's just some objects that seem to be affected by stuff like that. And there we go again. Oh, this road is really dangerous. Right, not going to be wasting too much time. Let's just drive around a little bit, see what the frame rate does. Although I actually do think that with the latest patches, the driving does not really reduce the frame rate that much anymore, or as much as it used to. It still reduces it, but I remember just when the game launched, or even a few months after, the frame rate would be reduced by around 25% even at times. And here you can see we are maintaining 70 frames per second. I'm just driving extremely slow here and not particularly well. But as you can see, we are definitely maintaining a 60 frames per second here at all times, and that's pretty good. And this is probably where I'd play with this GPU in my system. Alright, now that we've got that out of the way, let's see what happens at Ultra. Right, we're now on the Ultra preset, once again just reducing XeSS and then disabling post-processing effects. The rest are still all on Ultra. Ray tracing is disabled. Right, let's just start our counter here, and still in the 70 to 80 frames per second range. So not much difference between medium and ultra. We might see dips below 60 now. We got pretty close on the high preset, but in this specific area it does seem to perform similarly, right? Not perfectly. Oh, all right. So I mean, we are definitely dropping below 70 more frequently. But let's see once we actually start driving around. Maybe it's not a good idea to actually hijack a car in front of the cops. But you can see, well, that was quite a lot of shots. So you can see driving around, it's definitely below 70 a lot more often than on the high preset. Now, ultra gaming, I know there's a lot of talk out there, especially when it comes to 8GB VRAM GPUs, etc, etc. This is an 8GB VRAM GPU. The Arc A750 is a 16GB GPU, and unfortunately I can't find one of those. I would have loved to test it, but anyway, I'm not sure that the visual fidelity actually warrants the performance decrease by moving to ultra, right? 1080p high looks pretty good already. We're not running out of any VRAM here, and you can see that the game is able to maintain a 60 frames per second at all times here. I actually expected it to drop below 60 every now and again, but so far it hasn't, and this is actually a pretty good experience. Alright, so whilst we're at 1080p Ultra and I die, well, this is a pretty good time. I'm just going to enable XeSS. We'll just go with ultra quality. I'm going to put up on the screen exactly now what the resolution scaling looks like with XeSS. You can see that the internal resolution is slightly higher than FSR or DLSS quality, so I think that's actually perfect for 1080p. Alright, so we're still on the previous preset, which is our custom ultra preset, except I now have enabled XeSS Ultra Quality. The rest of the settings are still exactly the same. Ray tracing is disabled. And let's just see what happens to our frame rate here. So during my previous testing, I noticed around a 10% performance increase by going to XeSS Ultra Quality, and another 5% going to normal quality, and then it scales like 10 to 15% per setting depending on the game, obviously. So this is actually pretty good. There will be some additional artifacting. If you are going to pixel peep, it'll be a lot easier to actually see them, but I actually tried to stop him, so this time it's my fault. But you can see that we are now pretty much above 70 frames per second more often than not, and this is on the ultra preset. Our VRAM usage is still sitting at 6.2 gigabytes, which is definitely acceptable. I hate that the default view is now cockpit view, but still driving around we're dropping below 70 frames per second. Definitely not the end of the world, and I think that is actually perfectly fine for a GPU of this caliber. It's a relatively cheap GPU. I think I paid $300 for it, right? So for that money you can definitely get better GPUs, but the pricing in my region in South Africa is pretty skewed. Not sure what the MSRP of these GPUs in the US is at the moment, but I can tell you this, that it performs on par or slightly better than a 6600 XT in the games that I've tested so far. Diablo 4, it was quite a lot better than the 6600 XT, and in my region they go for exactly the same price, $300 new, but the performance on the 750 is slightly better. I'd still go for the 6600 XT if you're spending, or if you're choosing between these two. There's definitely better options that you can choose from at $300, but if you have to choose between these two GPUs, get the 6600 XT, as the drivers are definitely a lot more mature, it's a lot more stable, but Intel is definitely getting there if you have a look at what the performance was like a couple of months ago versus now. Alright, so we didn't really see much of an improvement with XeSS ultra quality. Maybe the lows were slightly better, but driving around we're still getting below 70 frames per second, and outside of the vehicle we're getting around 70 frames per second, right? So which is pretty good. All right, let's now test ray tracing. I'm going to go back to the medium preset here. Once again, just disable all of these. I'm going to disable XeSS, and now we can enable ray tracing in the settings that we want. So ray traced reflections actually do take a lot of processing power, but in my opinion it's one of the better looking ray tracing options. And then we'll use lighting on medium as well. I don't really care about shadows, it's personal preference obviously. Right, so let's see how it goes at, oops, that's the wrong button. So this is at 1080p native, right? And I'm not getting 30 frames per second even. There we go, 30 frames per second. So Intel is definitely still a ways behind with their ray tracing implementation. Obviously, it's only their first iteration of ray tracing. NVIDIA is sitting on their third iteration, and AMD on their second, so it makes sense that this is not really ideal, but to be honest I expected slightly better. I expected maybe a solid 30 frames per second at least. So let's see what we need to do to get to 60 frames per second here. Alright, we successfully managed to get to 60 frames per second. No, we haven't. Just have a look at what I had to enable here. XeSS is actually on performance mode, which now renders internally at 540p, and I mean, we are still not able to maintain 60 frames per second. And this is on the medium preset. Sure, we can maybe gain like maybe 5 to 10 frames per second if we drop down to the low preset. But at this point, it's just not worth it. I mean, you are effectively rendering at 540p and then reducing the graphical settings even more just to have nice reflections and lighting. Like, it just definitely defeats the purpose of ray tracing, right? So going forward with the next test with Cyberpunk and the GPU, I won't be testing ray tracing, as at 1080p we're not able to maintain 60 frames per second. So I'm just going to tell you straight, it's definitely not advisable to use ray tracing in Cyberpunk with this GPU. Alright, so that concludes our 1080p results. Let's see what happens at 1440p. Right, we're now on 1440p and ray tracing has been disabled. So I'm just going to go down to the medium preset again, just do what I usually do, disable XeSS and post-processing effects. And let's see what happens here. Alright, color me impressed. Getting 70 frames per second at 1440p. this is pretty good, right? This is more or less what we had at 1080p on the Ultra preset. Maybe slightly less, but the graphical fidelity is definitely better in my opinion. Sure, some textures would look better on Ultra than it does on 1440p medium, but I'm actually testing this as we speak on a 1440p monitor, and it does look pretty good, right? I wouldn't mind playing like this at all, is what I'm trying to say. Getting above 60 frames per second and 1440p for this GPU, I think it's definitely commendable. We did drop down below 60 frames per second there, but I do believe these drops wouldn't occur so much that it'll actually bother you. I mean, nobody would be able to tell the difference between 59 frames per second and 61 frames per second. So the occasional dip below 60 is definitely not the end of the world. And again, paying $300 for a GPU, you'd expect it to be usable at 1440p at least. And we can see that this GPU definitely is. Alright, that's it for 1440p medium. Let's see what happens at high. Right, we're on the high preset. So I just do this on camera just so that you can see that I'm not cheating in any way. We selected the high preset and then basically did the same as what we did for all the other presets. So let's start our count here, and now we actually see quite a bit of a performance impact going from medium to high. I don't know what I did wrong there. I mean, maybe slightly going over a sidewalk with a motor vehicle is against the law. Alright, so getting 50 frames per second pretty much. The input latency seems to be a little bit worse. I mean, it makes sense because the frame rate is lower, but dropping down from 70 frames per second to 45 frames per second definitely impacted the input latency negatively quite a bit. Still, this is not terrible. I wouldn't play like this though. 60 frames per second to me personally is the minimum. So if I had to play at 1440p, I definitely just select the medium preset, or we can just use XeSS, right? XeSS at 1440p is definitely usable. You can go up to the balance preset in my opinion and it'll still look pretty good. So before we do that, let's see what happens at 1440p Ultra, and then we'll start playing with XeSS. Right, once again we're on the Ultra preset, dropping down all that. I do click apply just to make sure that that actually gets applied, because sometimes it actually does not apply. So you can just do that to make sure. The rest of the settings are now on the Ultra preset. Ray tracing is still disabled, and I'm not really expecting a good experience here. Although it doesn't really look like it's gone down that much from the high preset. Sure, it probably will go down below 40 frames per second even. Once again, definitely not playable settings in my opinion. If you don't mind 30 frames per second experience, this will probably get you the best visuals for this game, for this GPU. 1440p on the Ultra preset, no upscaling. I mean, it does look good, it just doesn't perform that well. And seeing that it is a first-person shooter game, I would prefer a higher frame rate, especially when it comes to the input latency, right? So 30 frames per second for a first-person shooter, the input latency would be pretty terrible, especially if you are used to the input latency at 60 frames per second. But if you just want eye candy and you don't mind playing at 30 frames per second, then these settings can be used. Personally, I wouldn't recommend them, but obviously it's up to the individual. Alright, not going to be wasting too much time on this preset. As I said, I don't recommend it. So let's actually see what XeSS can do here for us. First, I'm just going to go to the high preset, because there we also had below 60 frames per second. So I'm just going to go with the XeSS. Let's start with ultra quality and see if it actually gets us 60, and then we'll go down from there. Alright, so we're getting 60 frames per second with the ultra quality. I'll just put up the upscaling chart again so you can see at what internal resolution it's actually running, because I'm not going to remember all those numbers. But you can see we're getting, let me just reset the numbers actually. You can see we're getting 60 frames per second. This is actually pretty good. So 1440p high with the XeSS on ultra quality. So the visual quality would definitely be better. Okay, I thought they fixed this. The visual quality would definitely be better than FSR at quality, or even DLSS at quality, because the internal resolution is slightly higher, right? And still be getting 60 frames per second, which is really commendable. I didn't expect it. I thought we'd have to go to quality or maybe even a balanced mode to get 60 frames per second. This is pretty good. Now let's just up the XeSS setting a bit and see what kind of frame rates we can actually get. Just going to leave the settings exactly as they are. Just going to go to quality. Let's reset our numbers here. And as you can see, we didn't gain much, but then again, there's not that big a difference between native and then going to ultra quality and then going to quality. All in all, you'd gain like 5% each setting. So from native to quality, you would net around 10 to 15%, right? But this is actually a pretty good experience. It looks good. As I said, at 1440p, you can even go down to balanced. Well, me personally, I don't mind playing at balanced at 1440p, as it still looks pretty good. It does definitely look better than 1080p on quality. So, and we are able to maintain a 60 frames per second experience at all times here. I must say that the Arc drivers definitely came a long way. Alright, I'm just going to let's just go to performance XeSS and see what kind of frame rates we can actually get before we start getting CPU bound. Right, we're now on the performance preset of XeSS, and I don't think the downgrade in visual fidelity is worth it. Right, so we were able to maintain 60 frames per second, even with the ultra quality preset on XeSS, so I think that's where I'd be playing that if I had a 1440p monitor connected to this GPU. Over here we are in the mid 70s to high 70s, whereas previously we were in the mid 60s, low 60s. So it definitely did improve our frame rate quite a bit. But as I said, unless you're looking for the highest possible frame rate, I think ultra quality or even quality XeSS modes would be fine. Alright, so let's leave the settings exactly as it is. I know I said I'm not going to be testing ray tracing at 1440p, but I'm going to leave the settings exactly as they are and just enable ray tracing, the same preset as what we had earlier. Alright, so what we had was just reflections and medium lighting, and let's see, we had around 80 frames per second previously, and now we're getting 40 frames per second. So our performance basically halved, right? Which is terrible. I mean, it's to be expected. It's just it's not ideal, and now the input latency is terrible. I actually tried to turn out of the way there, but delayed reactions caused that accident, or just my shoddy driving. I don't know. But you can see even our 1% lows are suffering quite a bit, sitting at 17 frames per second there for the 1% lows. Now it does show VRAM allocated as 9 gigabytes. We've got 8 gigabytes of VRAM on this GPU, so that's definitely not correct. But the VRAM usage is sitting at 7 gigabytes, so I think that's definitely more correct. Alright, so getting 40 frames per second with ray tracing on 1440p with XeSS in performance mode. Once again, not worth it. Ray tracing is supposed to make the game look better, and I just think that if you have to use such aggressive upscaling settings, then I just think it defeats the purpose of ray tracing. Alright, but that's just once again my opinion. You can see that the reflections do look quite nice, even at this lower internal resolution, but personally ray tracing is not worth it on this GPU in this game as of yet. Alright, last test is just to see how this game does at 4K, so let's see what happens. Alright, we're now at 4K. I know that the overlay, the MSI Afterburner overlay in the top left hand corner is now quite a bit smaller, but I don't want to risk alt-tabbing back into Windows to adjust that, because the game might crash. And let's just see, let's go for the medium preset, all right? And let's see what it does at native, okay? And once again, just disabling all of these. And we have no ray tracing enabled. All right, so 4K native on my customized the medium preset. Let's just reset our numbers here. And it's not looking good. I mean, the game looks good, but our frame rate is definitely not looking good. Getting 20 frames per second, yeah. and there's a big delay in anything happening. I mean, not just the input latency. Just to show you, I'm going to stand still and show you my steering wheel arm, if it actually shows up. I press the button now, and it's like almost half a second response time. Alright, so driving is definitely a lot more difficult. Once again, 25 frames per second or 24 frames per second. Cinematic experience. I accidentally reset our numbers there. I actually just wanted to view from outside. Like, once again, what did I do wrong there? Alright, but now we can actually see some performance numbers while there's a bit of action on the screen as well. It doesn't really go down that much, getting still 23 frames per second. Alright, this is definitely not going to work at all. So let's just see what actually is the highest frame rate we can get at 4K. And then for that, I'm just going to go all the way to performance. I'm not going to be testing ray tracing at all at this resolution. So I don't think that actually applied. Still sitting at 27 frames per second, right? So this is on performance. So let's just apply balanced and then apply performance again. And 27 frames per second. Okay, so we went from 23 to 27 frames per second. Let me just reload the save here, because that's definitely not correct. I actually think this game's XeSS implementation is slightly broken. I actually did manage to get 50 frames per second in my earlier testing, but now changing XeSS has no effect whatsoever. So I'm just going to go back into the main menu and try again. Alright, so even going into the main menu and coming back in, it still hasn't fixed our issue. Yeah, I did restart the game as well, so I think maybe it's just an XeSS bug, because as I said previously, I was able to actually get a decent frame rate. You can see that the setting hasn't really taken effect on the performance, but you can see there that it's definitely applied. You can see that the lighting under that garage there, it's definitely broken. I mean, this is just the upscaling tech doing its thing. So it's being applied, it's just not improving our frame rate. So that's just what you get for new tech, right? It'll probably be improved with future driver updates. At the moment, these GPUs are extremely new, and they do have some issues still, unfortunately. Alright, so that's where we're going to leave it for this video. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.